Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
To me, this is sort of like the high fructose corn syrup of evil, highly refined, sticky sweet, and bad for you no matter who you are.
And so I wanted to raise this faculty letter to Princeton from the Faculty of Princeton, or as they describe it, at this moment of massive global uprising in the name of racial justice, we the faculty, Black, Latinx, I never know how to pronounce that, but Latinx. Latinx is funnier than Latinx. So.
They're all Latinx.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast for the American Mind here at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. I'm joined, as always, actually, I should amend that. We don't have Matt Peterson today. He's teaching at our Publius Fellowship down at an undisclosed and safe location somewhere in Southern California. So he can't join us, but he's doing the Lord's work, teaching the children, when you listen to this, forgive me, you're not children, I know, but about higher education and the modern university and the university at the founding. So good luck with all that, Matt. But I am joined by Spencer Clavin, assistant editor of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind, David Barr, managing editor of the American Mind, and James Pullis, executive editor of the American Mind. Well, today we wanted to open with a discussion of Basement Joe. Joe Biden says that, his plan isn't to rebuild America if he wins, but rather to transform it. So echoing a theme from his former president when he was vice president. We were wondering, people keep talking about 68, about Nixon, about silent majorities while our revolutionaries are rampaging in the streets. Our producer, Jake, in our show notes said, well, maybe there's a silent majority, but remember Hillary won the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. And I just wanted to run the numbers and remind everyone, this is an obscuring statistic, as it was pointed out at the time, because it heavily relies on California. The differential in popular vote in California was 4.2 million. So California really is a giant vote bank for Democrats these days, very lopsided, a huge state, of course, dwarfing all the other states, even the big ones. So if you drop California out of it, I realize that's not realistic to just drop that differential completely, but it gives you some perspective. If you get rid of California, Cal-exit can't happen soon enough.
Oh, bring it on.
Trump would have won the popular vote by 1.4 million. So it's just food for thought there.
We could observe that Governor Gavin Newsom repeatedly refers to, with great relish, California as a nation state. And so you might be able to have it both ways for a couple more election cycles. But if they continue down this road, Democrats will have to lose those votes to a sovereign California.
Can only hope. Those of us living here on the, as I like to call Claremont and Upland, the western edge of real civilized California, that is red California. Hope maybe the Cal-exit includes a coastal Cal-exit, and then we can stay. But we're all going to have to move out of the state eventually. I just wanted to flag also, many of you saw this, but Tom Friedman in the New York Times is seeding the, what I consider to be, and I'm sure you guys agree, the communications op that will be convincing Biden that it's a moral imperative that he not debate Trump. Friedman beginning to lay down that groundwork. Because for those of us who've observed Biden lately, even on his highly produced and the result of many takes commercials, I mean, he can barely string a few sentences together without stumbling over his words. I don't know how well that's going to play in a debate. I suspect not well. And so I think the groundwork's being laid for Biden to sit out the debates, but we shall see. I do hope, among other things, his self-pride will overcome the calls from the knowing folks out in America and in his campaign for him to sit it out. I think his, Biden's a thematic man in many ways. We have evidence of it going way back, if not the sharpest, but definitely spirited. So perhaps he'll say, no, I got to saddle up and ride out. We got to take down the orange man. So we shall see.
Is he going to announce a running mate before the debates?
Good question. When are the debates? When's the first one? Do we know? August? We can look this up, but that's a good question, James. I think they were shooting to announce a running mate. I mean, they have to do it before the convention or the Zoom-vention, which I believe is in early August. I could be wrong.
Convention's mid, or is GOP in mid-August? They're both in August.
Yeah, both in August, right? So before then, at some point. And there usually is not a debate before the conventions.
The first presidential debate will take place on Tuesday, September 29th.
There you go.
So ways away.
That's an eon from now in current politics time.
In COVID years, that's epochs. Yeah, exactly.
So I like that even we, the professionals, are losing all concept of time and the sequence of months and events. But if that's right, then there's going to be a presumptive VP who can run around and control the narrative even during the debate season.
That's a good point.
How hard would it be to demand make the moral imperative that the VP should face off? That there should be some kind of, well, I guess they will have to face off themselves. Yeah. So
every year we have 3 for the presidents, 1 for the VP going back.
Yeah.
Right.
Decade.
And the ones like at the tabletop setup, right?
Yeah. Remember Biden's sneering performance against Paul Ryan.
Sure. Yeah. No, I guess I just mean
Paul who?
I guess I just mean his demanding to replace the presidential debates with some
Veep.
kind of beefed up Veep.
No, I don't think so. Okay. I would be shocked. Kamala versus Pence. That would be a barn burner for the ages.
Sorry, I think I'm losing it.
That's right.
Corpsing.
No, yeah. Well, we shall see. I think we have about 16 weeks or 120 days till the election. I think it's going to be a wild ride. I think, a lot of folks on our side are getting despondent and reading too many polls, whereas, most people don't really pay attention to presidential elections till a month out. Now, look, the professionals say, it can all get baked into the cake before then. But I just think, the critiques from the consultants about who rely on normal times as they did last round, I think have limited usefulness.
Well, I think, we're upset with Trump. This is really, in some ways, the problem. Or I personally am actually not that upset with him. But conservatives in general, looking out on the playing field, were disappointed with his response to the riots, felt it wasn't strong enough and so forth. I mean, the Mount Rushmore speech kind of turned that around. But I just think, y'all got to get off y'all got to get off the benches and get back in the game. This is just not the time. It's not the time to be walking around with a droopy face. It's not the time to be calling the election for Biden, even if you have personal problems. Once again, we return to the age-old issue. This is a binary choice, and save your litigations of Trump's various flaws and inadequacies for later. I just feel there's a lack of fighting spirit on the part of a lot of conservative commentators based on their, in some cases, legitimate concerns about how he responded over the last month or so to the crazy events that have been going on. But to me, all polling and responses to polling at this point is basically just sort of a public vetting of emotions on the part of elites. And I don't really like the emotions that I'm seeing, the kind of slumpy, sad sack emotions that I'm seeing from a lot of conservatives. I don't think it amounts to much more than that.
Well, it's true that there's, number one, some countervailing evidence. I mean, the latest poll that I saw out of, I think, The Hill has Biden +4, and, he has not been subject to any real attacks. Trump has not landed on a way to go after him yet. He, of course, is completely squirreled away. And so, this is sort of like the phony war period of World War II right now, which, heated up in a hurry once people actually started shooting at each other. But the other bit of this is this is the most uncertain time probably in world history since at least 1920, in the wake of World War I, when it was just a mad scramble for political reshuffling. If there was ever a time to sort of concede that it's hard to know what's going to happen over the next 120 days, it would be now.
Right.
And things being what they are, I mean, that ought to buoy up anyone who's feeling like the fix is in. But especially the partisans who would like for the embattled president with the highly motivated enemies to remain in office, I would think.
It seems to me that we collectively, as a capital S society, are addicted to fist-thumping proclamations of certainty about things, especially things in the future, which time and time again we are proven just to know nothing about. I'm kind of searching my memory of, ancient history to think about whether it was ever thus. That over and over again we make these stirring and confident proclamations that the latest advance in social science or political science or polling or what have you has enabled us with pinpoint accuracy to specify exactly how things are going to play out 20, 40 years down the line. And over again, we are proven not only catastrophically wrong, but embarrassingly wrong. And yet it just doesn't seem to make a dent. Is this some sort of like psychological tick of our age? Or are we just kind of like, is this just a sort of human problem? What James, what you're saying, it must be true, right? I mean, we were just joking.
That's my rule of thumb.
So yeah, I mean, like, what is this? You say this to people, and they say, "You're right. We really don't know anything," and then they move right on to sort of say, like, "But I'm going to tell you what's going to happen." It's very strange to me.
Well, I have an extended rant on this, which I'm sure everyone is delighted to hear.
Dying to hear it.
So much of what passes for expertise and what is sold as expertise and what is bought and rented and leased and shopped around as expertise is putative knowledge of the future, of the near future, right? Like there's such a high price and such a high prestige placed on experts who can say, hey, if you give me power, if you give me access, if you give me money, if you give me perhaps more tawdry side benefits, I will make your life better by accurately predicting what's about to happen. People do this through statistics. They do this through sort of quasi-occult ways of interpreting mass movements, or, they use emergence theory or any number of things that are impenetrable, including, most recently AI, where, we created this computer. We don't really know how it works or why it produces the results that it does. But it can tell you things that, about the near future that you can't learn any other way. That capture of like meta-analysis by elites is, I think, profoundly anti-democratic. And as far as that goes, at risk of being at least anti-American, where the experts say, oh, we've got it figured out. This is what the outcome's going to be. And then they use that authoritative prediction to preempt the actual sequence of events, including the sort of actual flow of democratic deliberation. And I think that you see this explicitly now, where organized experts, commentators, media figures are hellbent on preempting the actual election and the actual campaign with a sort of meta campaign that is designed to prepare the groundwork and shape the environment in a way that will produce their desired result. That's sort of troubling enough as it is. But there's another layer too, I think. I suppose British novelist L.P. Hartley once remarked, the past is a foreign country. The recent past is especially foreign to us. So few experts, especially of like a high intellectual caliber, are incentivized to put their effort into understanding, exploring first, and then actually understanding what it is that already just happened, which I would argue in almost all cases is considerably more important to understand how to proceed in life than trying to take a stab at what it is that's about to happen. the whole sort of glamour or charisma or cachet of predicting the near future with oracular expertise or insight really does a disservice to a culture or a country that needs to know what it is that has already happened in order to figure out what the next move is. That's the kind of information that I think is key to democratic deliberation, that has any kind of, circumspection and prudential judgment to it. And that's the kind of cultural and political process that status-seeking elites seem, regardless of historical era, to be drawn toward deprivileging.
Well, in many instances, actually, our current elites, at least, are disincentivized from understanding or even talking about what just happened, because in many cases, what just happened is that they were very wrong. And so there's this, feedback loop, I think, in what you're saying, which is that if you are inclined to memory hole the fact that 5 seconds ago you thought masks were, not only useless, but worse than useless, then you are in fact almost structurally, discouraged from learning from your past mistakes or just from the recent past at all, the way that you're describing. I mean, I suppose that the kind of the ancient question that lurks behind this whole thing is I guess the free will and determinism question, right? That's perhaps the most basic set of issues that we're looking at is, given, let's even just imagine godlike knowledge of everything that has happened up to this point. Would that information give you sort of a set of doctrines and wisdom about general trends in human nature, or would it give you a kind of, Minority Report-esque quasi scientific, physical description of exactly what is going to happen next? In which case, really, if you boil it down, there is no need for democracy, which is kind of intriguing that is basically the view of our emerging ruling class elite, despite their willingness to use democracy as a sort of standard under which to march. They actually don't really believe that will be necessary in some distant future or immediate future, perhaps.
Well, right. So, what is it that just happened? The response is usually, whatever it was, only we can fix it.
Yeah, that presages part of our next section very nicely. But I wanted to, before we move on, raise a couple of things. We should say a couple words at least about the Rushmore speech, which was delivered on July 3rd, which last Friday. And I thought Trump was in rare form, probably the best speech of his presidency, if not in delivery, then in substance. And the coverage of it was remarkable. It's days stale now, so many others have pointed this out. But Trump, who kind of gave a list of American heroes transcending both race and class, and then with some of the regulars, of course, from the founding and up through Teddy Roosevelt and others, it was described by some as, by Senator Tammy Duckworth as just a list of old dead racists, basically, implying that he was just defending a bunch of Confederates when he named not a single one, as far as I could tell. And really a call to defend the American way of life, which a phrase that I think Trump's team got from us, from the American Mind and Claremont Institute's chairman, Tom Klingenstein, who wrote a piece, an essay for us called Exhorting Republicans to Have Something as Their Purpose and Big Vision in this election cycle, and that was to preserve the American way of life against its various enemies, rampaging in the streets and in our halls of Congress at the moment. I thought that was notable. And Trump, since, he did an interview the other day in which he said fighting this culture war is going to be a priority of his. And I think if you take that and marry it to this executive order, which didn't get much notice in the last few days, of Barr and the Justice Department basically pledging to mass, as far as they can, ATF, DOJ, et cetera, people and even federal law enforcement officials to states that need it. I think they're going to start in Kansas City, which had this huge spike, remarkable spike, like a lot of cities, in violent crime and murders in the last month or so. Our friend Heather McDonald and others are calling this the Black Lives Matter effect, which is a successor to the Ferguson effect, which is if you villainize police and throw them in jail and try to prosecute them for doing their job, with the caveat, of course, some abuse their power and deserve to be prosecuted. But if you do that as a general mode of policy, especially with this racialized tint to it, lo and behold, they draw back a little bit, especially in neighborhoods that are very violent, which happen to be disproportionately communities of color. Forgive the term, but I use the terms of the day. So take all this together, I think that with federal law enforcement offering to help quell this problem, we'll see what the details look like. And with Trump going on a culture war, the dark and divisive speech at Mount Rushmore, which, as it was called by the mainstream media, whereas we saw it as a hopeful celebration of the great heroes of America and of American greatness, I think the terms are set for this election. And I think while one side ought to win, we think let's hope they deserve to win.
More darkness, more division. That's my rallying. I mean, if that's what darkness and division looks like. And of course, Ryan, as you say, it's not that at all. I mean, it was probably the most patent expression of kind of where our major media institutions are at, that qualifies for them as divisive, when in fact their whole life is at this point about driving successive crowbars into the American polity and prying us apart. But I don't want to fangirl too much about this speech, but I thought it was a titanic moment of Trump's presidency. The only thing I will add to what's already been said about it, which I think has not yet been remarked upon quite enough, is that it was not one of Trump's sort of improvised, his critics might say flailing speeches, in his typical style of just, casting about for sort of impromptu moments. He kind of read the speech, and it was a very, very well written speech that whoever wrote it should, be his speechwriter from now on, in my opinion. But it was composed in such a fashion that although it was sort of more elevated than a lot of his other speeches, he could read it in a genuine way. This person had tapped into some feature of Trump's diction, his very unique and distinctive diction, that enabled him to just write sort of high-flown language that also sounded Trumpian. And I actually think that's really important because, as people have said recently, the fact that Trump can't hold a team of kind of hoary advisors around him is actually a problem. Despite our endorsement of his desire to drain the swamp and all that stuff, you do actually need seasoned political professionals to help run a presidency. And if he's found that in his speechwriting team in a way that can be authentic with kind of what his message is and what his general attitude is, which is a big part of his message, then I think that's very hopeful.
Yeah.
I think it's hope. Sorry, go on, Ryan.
No, please, Dave.
I just, I think it's, I can't decide whether or not his re-election team is doing an adequate job of pushing out these victories to people that need to hear it, of clarifying the terms of debate. So we study this stuff every day. So the what's at stake is clear to me. It's clear to everybody here. I don't know if it's yet clear to the majority of Americans or to Americans that need to hear it. And I worry that his message isn't reaching as many people as it could be. Now, I don't have any data to support that. But other than I think that with Biden continuing to dodge Trump, I don't know how he gets a contrasting narrative out to the public. Maybe it's simply through action. Maybe it's simply, well, you will see your cities, you'll see federal law enforcement on city streets, and you will have a safer city. And maybe that's sufficient. I just don't know.
Well, he faces I think, really at this point, distinctive challenge. The hostility of our major media outlets toward him has increased so much in degree that it's almost reached a different level in kind, that I'm actually not sure that even a kind of well-trained media team would be able to draw on some of its tried and true resources for the task that you're describing, David, because I absolutely agree. He's got to get this stuff out more. One thing that a friend of mine said to me recently that I think is actually very fair is, people constantly tearing their hair out about Trump's impulsivity, the fact that he's, he tweets without thinking. Why doesn't he, consider more and think before he acts? And now they're dinging him for doing precisely that. I mean, inaction has been the major criticism against him. And I do sort of wonder, perhaps this is just too optimistic, but I do sort of wonder whether, all this time that we're waiting for him to do something, he's obviously at least been thinking about how to message, because he came out with this incredible speech. I'm not so sure that we've seen really even yet the fullness of what they're planning or trying to do. I hope that what they're using this time for is sort of circling the wagons, reconsidering their strategies, addressing those unique challenges that they, I think, now face. And, I still have a lot of faith that that could be what they're doing. It is, as we've said, stressed now in this segment. It's very early days, and I hope that's true.
Yeah, it is early days, and the marker has been laid down, I think, effectively. Here's what needs to be developed, I think, from a philosophical and a political standpoint. I've already started seeing criticism of the preserve the America way of life idea. And the criticism is, this is just nostalgia. Republicans always want to go back to 1957. It's 2.5 kids in the suburb, and dad puts on his hat and drives to the factory or the office or whatever. And, it's this pickled, obsolete version of American life at a time when the United States was the only undamaged economic power in the world of any significance, right? Where World War II left everyone else in ruins, and we were the greatest, and we were young, and it was a spirit of triumphalism and also of great complacency in some ways. I understand where that argument is coming from, but I think what needs to be demonstrated is that the American way of life is much deeper and much grander and much more transcendent of any particular time and place than what the critics are already beginning to say. The culture of the American way of life is something that reaches all the way to the foundations of the role of religion in ordering and stabilizing society, the mechanics of education, and the kinds of cultural pieties that are needed to educate people for free and equal citizenship. And the foundations of the culture in the American way of life are, of course, firmly connected with the biological family. These are things that are not comprehensible as artifacts of nostalgia. They're things that reach back to the very origins of Western civilization. And the wager of the American way of life is that those things are not the possession merely of the ancients or the moderns or the medievals or anyone else, but are a precious inheritance that plays out here in unique and particular ways, but which always draw us back to the universals in a way that must be safeguarded in order for our quotidian everyday lives to be worth the trouble and the struggle and the trial of everyday life.
James, that was exceedingly beautiful. I regret to inform you all that I am about to talk about Hamilton. But it is related to what you have just said.
The musical?
The musical Hamilton, yes. I rewatched it last night because it's streaming. Everybody's talking about it. I have seen it already, so this was not my first encounter with it. But back when it was really big, I had the same reaction to it then that I had now, which is, we have published criticism of the musical for its historical inaccuracies, which are certainly there. It tends not to get a really good hearing with conservatives because it is, first of all, like kind of a rap opera or a hip hop opera, whatever you want to call it. And also they sense, I think rightly, a certain degree of hostility in the sort of feel good happy talk that surrounds it as a musical. All of that having been said, I'm sorry, but I just don't think we're getting anywhere by nitpicking stuff like this musical, which ultimately, in its broad strokes is, whatever you may feel about some of its finer points of political philosophy, in its broad strokes, it is an undeniably great work of musical theater and tremendously adroit and successful act of lyric writing and so forth, marshaled and tremendous energy, sort of youthful vitality and energy, all of which marshaled in the expression of, basically sentiments, many of which are quite fundamentally American. There is a real sense of family kind of driven by Lin-Manuel Miranda's, I think, background and origins. There is a, celebration of the founding as an act of tremendous thumotic vitality, to use a word that Ryan just used. And I think that one thing that conservatives always do is we bemoan our lack of cultural authority. And then we go on to nitpick things like Hamilton and never make versions of our own. And the kind of, deep rooted, but also, powerfully transcendent and eternal access to just the essentials of your life as a human being on this earth that James is talking about can be translated much, much more vigorously by us, I think, into cultural artifacts, not just, political speeches, but actual, works of art. And, in this moment, like political ads and all this stuff that are a lot more or a lot less fusty, let's say, than what our critics want to claim that we are. But we do have to make that case in an aesthetic way, in my opinion.
Points well taken, Spencer. You're right. Our approach to the recovery of our inheritance, as James put it, has to be holistic, to use a perfectly valid term that has been perverted and twisted by modern consulting and business speak, but it applies. Well, we thought for this second segment to bring up a long-running theme here on The American Mind, which is the ascent of artificial intelligence and its contribution to our wokeness. We've talked about on this as soon as last week about AI's, the bots' participation in our new dreamed for woke regime that the left has ginned up for us. That is to say, the experts in social justice will increasingly become artificial intelligence. It's truly a way to get real experts and get the parochial and self-interested people out of the business of enforcement of this new regime. And so we present to you a new app called Textio. Well, it's really a software suite. So in the business of online writing, a big part of it is something called search engine optimization. Now, when you type something into Google, it predicts what you're trying to type. Certain phrases lead you certain places. There's this whole elaborate algorithmic, et cetera, infrastructure that produces all of this. And to get good traffic to your website, it helps to use phrases that tend to draw people to your argument, absent whatever specific content of your argument you're trying to convey. And there are all sorts of tools out there of what phrase you should use, if you want to drive people to a certain subject rather than another phrase, what are the more popular words, et cetera, et cetera. So this was inevitable that something like Textio would come along. I'm sure it's not the first thing. It just happened to pop on our radar. And what Textio does is it encourages you through a nice fancy interface to use words and phrases that tend to attract or represent or pluck the heartstrings of people of color, minorities, women, etc. So it pitches itself as your go-to tool to make sure that you're not sexist or racist, etc. And how you write on your website. On their front page, their biggest their example of this, which will tell all of you in some detail what it actually means, is it takes a sentence. Are you driven by the ability to set and exceed results-oriented goals? And a little Textio pop-up grabs the driven by and says the following: you could attract more women to apply by changing your language. So obviously this is a job application. Instead, you could try inspired by rather than driven by. We're raising the standard for writing platforms, bias interruption that goes beyond gender, expanded language insights, and new integrations. Now more than ever, make your words matter. First of all, that's a terrible sentence with all the lame anyway. One of the ticks of modern consultant speak is to make up all sorts of new verbs that aren't verbs, and you get a flavor of that there. But Textio, how to write wokely.
Every sentence involved in this app is an abomination, and not for the reason that the authors think.
We gave Spencer Valium early, actually, on this podcast because we knew this one would really trigger him.
Oh, it's already wearing off. I feel like it's like the volcano just reaching the. Well, no, I mean, it's an insult. It's an insult to women. It's an insult to readers. It's an insult to writers. Google for a while, Gmail for a while, has done this thing where as you type, it suggests the end of your sentence for you in sort of less bold type, which I can't think of anything more sort of deadly to the writing process, frankly. I mean, at least my own writing process, I don't know what you guys do, but for me, almost all of the writing process is contained in that split second before some other wrong word has entered your head, grasping at the thing that just pins down precisely the concept you want. And the reason that the Google thing is so appalling is because it completely erases that process in favor of Google's sort of preconditioned, predetermined ideas about just like stock sentences. Basically turns you and your brain into a machine for creating SEO optimized stock phrases and sentences. It is no secret, it has not been a secret for quite some time, that is basically exactly what the vanguard of the social justice movement wishes to do with each of us. There was a Now This video quite some time ago that talked about feminism reconditioning people's brains as if that were a consummation devoutly to be wished. This is not just an app for, helping McDonald's to be like more approvable in the eyes of some blue-haired idiot. This is an app for rewiring your brain, and like language does. I mean, they are correct. Words do matter. Language does matter. This is certainly an attack on English prose, and that's what goes deepest to my heart. But I know that that's not for everybody. I mean, I just like feel that this is actually a really perfect encapsulation of the depth of evil that we are facing up against.
Yes, to me, this is sort of like the high fructose corn syrup of evil, highly refined, sticky sweet, and bad for you no matter who you are. We already know that the putative anti-racists and putative anti-fascists are in fact anti-culture. And this is a perfect illustration of how and why. They have contempt for classical education. They have resentment toward biblical religion, and they feel fury and rage toward the biological family. And you add those three things together and you get anti-culturalism. And language is the core of culture in this way. When it becomes impossible to think and articulate language at its most fundamental level of the building blocks of language, then you are already coming unglued from your culture, and you're replacing culture with a technology that is not culture. Even though it's easy to laugh at sort of these like pathetic stereotypes being converted into recommended phrases, it is dehumanizing. And there is, and always has been, a deep-seated desire in the human heart for all the benefits of dehumanization and none of the drawbacks. You know, who wouldn't want a bot, a machine that was a slave? And this slave's job was to optimize your public appearance online for wokeness, right? Gone are all of those chores that you've been assigned to do the readings, do the work, reprogram your mind, toil away in the salt mines of, you know, deculturalization and psychological reconditioning. Now you can simply allow a bot to appropriate your identity and present it for the powers that be as the very latest state-of-the-art, up-to-the-minute correctness in speech with regard to the presentation of the correct symbols and the invocation of the correct names, and the, you know, the anatomically correct kinds of genuflections before the correct people with the correct ranks of power and status. That relationship between technology and culture is one that I think is not just hostile to life, but it is certainly hostile to Western civilization. And if there's anything that characterizes the uniqueness of the American way of life, I would say it's a certain attitude of hopefulness and optimism with some discipline and focus to it, that technology and culture can actually work together and in harmony. You know, you think of the nostalgia of the 50s and what it contains. And one of the things that it contains, which is not particular to the 50s, but seems to be sometimes, is, you know, those images of young children playing with toy cars and toy airplanes, machines that served human beings rather than the other way around. And machines that were not, strictly speaking, sort of robotic slaves, but rather tools that human beings used in order to sort of increase the magnificence and pleasure of everyday life. The kinds of machines that are being inserted into our lives now are not those kinds of machines. They tempt us in all the wrong ways to be masters with slaves, and then they tempt us in all the wrong ways to be slaves with masters.
Yeah, and they it also just, it can only accelerate, it seems to me, this kind of thing. I mean, this is for, you know, at least on their front page, it's how to better write and better appeal to your desired demographic, your job position that you want to sell to such people. But it can't help but just eventually be applied, and soon be applied, if it's not already, I'm sure it is, to the collapse of our ability to speak to citizens as citizens, and rather to speak to them as identifiable identity groups in these infinitely fine-tuned ways of appealing to them. It leads me to, I will say, I'll put in one good word for Textio. I kind of want the trial version, because on the side of this example they have, you get a Textio score. This one that they have on their front page, it's below average. It has a slightly masculine tone. It appeals to older people. They have bullet points for why this all is. It contains too many questions. The sentences are too long, and it uses fixed mindset language. We should play with this on The American Mind. I would like to get the lowest score possible on Textio, and it could be fun to play with it in that fashion. But
I do my best at all times to write with an exceedingly masculine
tone. For long-time listeners, you know this podcast can be quite masculine, maybe too much so. No, never too much.
Never too much.
Textio would disapprove, but no, it's just this continuing, just relentless trend of modern politics, which really picked up a head of steam in the late 60s and now is on overdrive, to say the least, of dividing and conquering identity groups in order to advance political power. And we should have no truck with such things, and we should do what we can to break up this madness.
Well, one of the things that James said just now that got me thinking is that really all sort of Byzantine and arcane forms of social nicety are at least at some level a form of power, right? These hyper excessive, like the Vichy, or rather the court of King Louis, and the way that you have to scratch on his door with your third fingernail, right? All of that is a way of making you feel constantly on edge. And as James has very astutely observed, one of the intended reactions of that is for people, ordinary folks, to look at this vast pile, this mound of requirements for how to neatly thread your way through every possible landmine that might explode on you and get you canceled, that you just want to throw up your hands and quote unquote neutralize your way of life and speech, which means ostensibly in your mind means clearing it of all connotations, negative, positive, or otherwise, just this kind of blank, Apple iPhone Black Mirror style of really contentless, but certainly connotationless speech, which is basically what Textio is promising to do. And as James also identifies, this is fundamentally antithetical to what language is. Language has been called, and rightly called, a graveyard of dead metaphor. And one of the things that it does that is so beautiful for those of us who love it is that it carries through time the corpses and the memorials of all our ancestors' ways of thinking about things and looking at the world, even and especially when those ways were not our ways. Anybody who has learned another language can tell you that you are not simply learning a bunch of other words, you are learning a bunch of other boxes into which you can place the somewhat malleable material of reality, and you organize those things differently as a way of seeing them differently. The English language, if you speak it, you don't have to speak it, in a highly erudite way. You only have to speak it in a natural way to be connected to your forefathers and their forefathers before them and theirs before them, which is exactly what so offends and appalls our new Jacobins who want to tear down the statues. They also want to tear down the compound verbs.
Yeah, and I think a wonderful example of the people driving this kind of thing, the fine folks at Textio, I'm sure, are mostly engineers and et cetera, working in this field because it's a way to make a buck. There's lots of, it'd be unfair to them to call this a grift, because actually it's probably pretty useful for our new regime of wokeness, even though we disagree with the parameters of it. But the real drivers of this kind of thing, of course, are in higher education. And so I wanted to raise this faculty letter to Princeton from the Faculty of Princeton, or as they describe it, at this moment of massive global uprising in the name of racial justice, we the faculty, Black, Latinx, I never know how to pronounce that, but Latinx is funnier than Latinx.
Girl, Latinx. She's my friend.
Asian and members of all communities of color, along with our white colleagues, call upon the university, blah, blah, blah. So it's a bunch of series of demands. We've talked about on this podcast and written on The American Mind that the new regime that is replacing the regime of the equal protection for all of equal rights is this new kind of racial case system where the formerly high are brought low and the formerly low are brought high, oppressor and oppressed, reverse roles. And there's a kind of expertly administered new system of the reallocation of honors, goods, wealth, etc. Indicative of that is demand number 5. I thought it was interesting for a couple of reasons. I'll just read it. Reward the invisible work done by faculty of color with course relief and summer salary. As of the fall of 1920 academic year, faculty of color make up only 7% of the laddered faculty. But they are routinely called upon to exert influence in hiring committees and to stand as emblems and spokespersons of diversity at Princeton, being required to chiefly and constantly serve and represent in the interest of administrative goals, robs the imagination and interrupts any possibility of concerted thought. Faculty of color hired at the junior level should be guaranteed one additional semester of sabbatical on top of the 1 in 6 provision. Elsewhere, they call for them to be paid a little more, paid for summer work, etc. This is interesting. I mean, the way I interpret that is the lefty mindset, identity politics mindset, says that only persons of color can represent and speak for persons of color. We're sort of rationally incapable of taking up the desires, passions, and needs rationally of our fellow citizens, regardless of color. So we have to have identity groups stand for this kind of thing. So they call on these identity groups at Princeton to do the work of those identity groups and school them all on it. And so naturally, they all need to be compensated for it. I guess on their own terms, it makes perfect sense. But to normal Americans, this kind of thing is crazy. And then number 8, just a few down, we've talked about Ibram Kendi's tyrannical desire to create a department of anti-racism in which he will work and to help school all of us and wield the power of the state to carry out the vision of the new transformation of our civil rights regime. But, it's here on the campus demands. It lines up perfectly with the desire of somebody like Kendi in government, and it's create a center specifically dedicated to racism and anti-racism that can work alongside the Department of African American Studies. So this type of department, of course, will be the engine of the generator and credentialer of the bureaucrats and the theory that the bureaucrats will use in such a Kendi Department of Anti-Racism. So this again, the symbiotic relationship between the modern academy and the administrative state is on full display. I'll dredge up and then I'll shut up. The phrase from our colleague John Marini, who has called, really the modern university is the place where the applied science of the administrative state is churned out. So the symbiotic relationship is perfectly predictable. And as I've said in recently, and I stole it, I think, from Charles Kessler, there's just another data point in the reality we live in, which is we all now live on campus. And the madness of the 90s on campus when conservatives, were worried about it, but said most normal Americans of a right leaning said, yeah, I know it's crazy. I mean, it is crazy, but it's just campus, and half the kids there don't really pay attention to it. But it's now full frontal.
So I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on the following point, probably because I find it boring and beneath me to spend my life confined in someone else's intellectual sandbox. But this really is an instance of Marxism and identity politics intersecting and reinforcing one another. The more that the bots exceed the skills and abilities of even the most expert human beings at performing wokeness properly, the more media figures and academicians who have dedicated themselves to becoming experts at properly performing wokeness are going to find their work rendered invisible and their livelihoods zapped away by robots. Even if the upshot of that is that, as the letter suggested, humans will continue to be rewarded and continue to accrue status based not on what they do or how well they do it, but simply in virtue of who they are. So you get both kind of the utopian Marxist end of economic life, and at the same time you get a continued Marxist reallocation of value based not on economic worth or on productivity or performance, but simply on one's identity. That may sound like a utopian outcome for the people who control our communications and education systems. But it, I find it hard to imagine. I find it hard to see how real human beings, rather than the human beings living in people's imaginations, would actually be able to withstand that kind of future without sort of losing their minds and giving up on that perverse of a system.
And like all sort of ostensibly just but actually communist projects, this one will also devolve just into pure cronyism and loyalty politics, right? Already in this letter, the people who will be rewarded with the jobs and the positions and the extra salary bump are not just people of a certain color or race or background or sexuality, but Black people who support anti-racism, right? And this is, for a long time, it's been well noted, is part of the ideology on display here. It's not, you can have the sort of beloved identity only if you also ascribe to the right politics. Peter Thiel doesn't actually get to be gay. Candace Owens doesn't actually get to be Black, and so forth and so forth. This is all sort of well-trodden ground. And when the dynamic change that you are identifying sort of meets up with that fact, we will find that, once again, it's just sort of, who is loyal to Stalin. What the party says today is true. What the party says tomorrow is also true, even if they contradict one another. I mean, those are also kind of just rudimentary elements of this sort of development, but are certainly going to be the consequence here. It's, it sure ain't going to be like, the Thomas Sowell chair of anti-racism. I'll tell you that.
No. A man who wrote a book in defense of discrimination in the old sense of that word. No. We should move on to the last segment, but I just wanted to flag for fun and really to plant a marker and appeal to Princeton. So Princeton, one of their demands is also to commit fully to anti-racist campus iconography, beginning with the removal of the John Witherspoon statue near Firestone Library. And they wanted to look into Firestone Company's Liberian plantation, hundreds of years ago, I'm sure, or whatever it was. I will just say, for one, we're happy to take the Witherspoon statue off Princeton's hands. And they're contradictory on this. They don't really appreciate how far all of this must go, because Princeton, of course, is named after William of Orange, who was Prince of Orange before he took over as King of England after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Well, he took over in 89. But William of Orange, of course, not only presided over the slave trade that the British Empire was running, but expanded it significantly. The Crown's holdings in it and the state-sponsored enterprises that the Crown ran. So Princeton has changed its name, of course. Just like Yale has to change its name because Elihu Yale was a slave trader. So, let's run this all the way to the ground, folks. If you want to play this game, let's do it. It's reminiscent of... cultural revolution is thrown around a lot these days, but of course, one of the things that happened in Mao's China was to dig up Confucius's grave and desecrate all the iconography of Confucius, thousands of years old. So why shouldn't we do it for a few hundred years? Let's get after it, Princeton.
21st century, doing something mean to it. Do it better than anybody you ever seen. Do it. Screams from the haters, got a nice ring to it. I guess every superhero need his theme music. No one man should have all that power. The clock's ticking, I just count the hours. Stop tripping, I'm tripping off the power. The system broken, the schools closed, the prisons.
Finally, we want to talk about the wonderful, the Yeezy-tastic.
Okay, Kellexit and Yeezy-tastic. I think you're expelled, right?
I don't know how many of our listeners know that Yeezy is a nickname for Kanye West, but it is. Kanye West running for president, allegedly, with a blockbuster announcement and interview in which he said, among other things, that, of course, it's racist to assume that blacks vote for Democrats all the time. And he'd be happy to take votes from Biden or Trump. It just depends on how it all shakes out. Can 2020 get any weirder? We have plenty of time left between now and the election, but Kanye West seems determined, as he has been in recent years, to throw some wrenches in national, political, and cultural life. We'll see what happens.
It's a bright spot. It's a bright spot on the dark, dark face of 2020. It's like the one third-party candidate that I would ever be excited about.
Can you imagine a Trump, Biden, Kanye debate?
I can
I'm
imagine
imagining it right now.
Yeah,
James
I'm
Salvator.
going to my happy place.
yeah. I've been on the Kanye train since he released that album. I've now forgotten what it's called, the Christian album, Jesus is King.
Right.
Jesus is King.
Yeah.
In sharp contrast to Beyonce's Black is King.
Right. Well, precisely so. And he released his well, first of all, I don't know if you guys tracked this fascinating bit of Kanye performance art the other day, in which he first tweeted a screenshot of fetus at 6 months. He'd Googled fetus at 6 months, got a picture of fetus at 6 months, and then tweeted that with "These souls deserve to live." Then he deleted that tweet and then posted just a series of pictures of his own children, knowing that the screenshots of the tweet were already out in the world. So that is the kind of, just pristine media savvy we can look forward to from Kanye. And I think having it out there from a guy who, crazy though he is, genuinely is speaking his mind can only be to the good.
There is inevitable backlash from people who think that Kanye and his extended family are, let's say, something less than authentic in the way that they present themselves to the world and use those presentations for their own increased personal power. I would submit that this is actually a misread of the situation, and that authentic, genuine, bottom-up changes in our culture, not just in terms of sort of moving away from standard modern American configurations of politics and culture, but bringing back extremely old configuration. I think those things are real, and I think that Kanye has proven himself, especially over the past 10 years, at being absolutely attuned to what those movements are and what their trajectories are. And he has listened with a very fine-tuned ear to what possibilities those changes are creating in our American life. And to see him take what, by any measure, is a risky step, even a scary step, in the direction of positioning himself explicitly as a leader of those movements, I think is like a top 3 most important trend in American political life that is going to continue to strengthen regardless of anything else.
Yeah, in a way, he's much more like Trump than Biden in that sense. I mean, a kind of a, Trump who people forget. Many of our listeners don't, but a big source of his success was his marketing savvy, and his people also forget that he spent quite a bit of time studying the landscape of disgruntled Republicans and what issues they were disgruntled about, and chose that as his lane, and was very successful at it, and has been a kind of savvy observer of American political and cultural trends. And I think James, you're right about that, about Kanye too.
The other thing we need to watch is we have to watch how the entertainment industry reacts. So there are reports today that his family is saying, look, he's unwell. This is a bipolar episode.
Huh.
And I don't know how well substantiated those comments are, but it's not without precedent that the entertainment industry can circle the wagons, and in a year or two, Kanye can be frozen out.
Yeah.
And he's good at creating. First of all, he's a good artist, so it's hard to kind of deny that. But there's a lot of power there, and if they want to freeze you out, whether it's Hollywood or the music industry, do it, man, and in all sorts of ways.
It also speaks to the fact that at this point, you actually can tell a lot about somebody by who his enemies are, and the fact that the people from whom the screeching was coming upon Kanye's announcement already predetermined my opinion about it.
Plus, to think that our elites in Hollywood and national politics on the left could accuse anyone credibly of being inauthentic is also laughable. Yeah, we should also say a kind word and talk just a bit about, courage and forthrightness and speaking truth ought to be rewarded and recognized these days. So we should say a word about Terry Crews, black actor, among other things. President Camacho in the great Mike Judge, although not safe for most children. I will warn some of our listeners who haven't seen it. Really prescient, actually, send up of the worst parts of American culture called Idiocracy from years back. Terry Crews was the President Camacho in that, former wrestler turned president. Anyway, go check it out if you haven't. But again, not safe for children under 15. But Terry Crews has been tweeting a lot and been getting lots of flack and really sticking to his guns that, look, Black Lives Matter doesn't speak for me. Among other things, I have a nice nuclear family. I think nuclear families are good. Just go to their website. They want to destroy the nuclear family. They're Marxists. This is a bad turn in American sort of racial identity politics. And, he went on Don Lemon's show, as Tucker calls him.
I was today years old when I heard that for the first time.
Don Lemon.
Don Lemon. Yeah, that's great.
And, Lemon was doing his best to sort of talk over Crews and squelch his what I think is a very positive message and should get more airtime, which is that Black Lives Matter, the organization, is poison to American politics and Western civilization as a whole and ought to be opposed at every turn. And the more, black voices in America you can get speaking out against it, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Especially ones with platforms and who are beloved, like Terry Crews. Let him remain beloved and getting work.
I know. Why haven't we given him a platform yet? Not we, Claremont. I mean,
Terry Crews, American Mind essay coming up.
Lincoln Fellow. No, I just mean, does he not have his own show? Why has not somebody picked him up as a producer or something? I mean, these venues that he's going on are all hostile venues, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, as we all know, part of the defects of the right in these days, and some on the right are scrambling to fix this, is the lack of sort of media and cultural platforms to empower and elevate folks like this.
Mm-hmm. No, I love the idea that, Kanye is somehow to be disqualified because his interior motives are not pure as the driven snow, or that Terry Crews or anybody in public life should be suspected of insincerity. The most virtuous and self-sacrificing public servant ever alive also has ambition. That's why they're in the business. You can't, and it is, of course, as you suggested, Ryan, it's laughable even to hear this critique coming from the most careerist, most mercenary media class that perhaps we've ever seen in this country, and that's saying something. Mm-hmm. But even just leaving that aside, even imagining that the people making this attack on Kanye or anybody were sort of generally sincere, nobody could suggest that they or anyone who sets out to put his face on a TV screen doesn't have some amount of self-promotional impulse. That's preposterous. It's the question on the table is not, how genuine is X or Y political figure or media figure, but how successfully and with what kind of integrity does he or she marshal his or her ambition and media talent to express a real sentiment among the populace.
It ignores as well the palpably obvious fact of all the money to be made right now if you spout the party line. I mean, right. Robin DiAngelo, fraud that she is, hectoring white lady with her anti-white fragility book, charges $40,000 a speech. Ibram Kendi is in Wall Street Journal's glossy weekend magazine, with jeans on and his tweed, looking with a sort of shot slightly up, with him with a bunch of books behind him. I mean, the people who are in this business have done quite well. I'm sure some of them are sincere, but it's not as if they're brave warriors, doing this while struggling in penury. I mean, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Well, our friend Nicole Hannah-Jones just announced today she inked a deal with Lionsgate Film to
and Oprah, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oprah, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Lionsgate are getting together to bring 1619 to screens near you in whatever form that will take.
It'll be like that U2 album that got downloaded into everybody's phone without their permission. It's going to be like that. And you're just going to have to watch it before you watch it.
You must watch the 1619 programming. No, I mean, when on our more cynical days, we just think, man, I just got to convert to the other side and get in on this grift. Exactly. I could retire in like 5 years. Former president of Claremont Institute renounces all friends.
Well, I do currently charge $40,000 for each speak. Do you guys not charge?
That is my going rate. Yeah. Sadly, no one has taken me up on it yet.
Well, right, but you charge. I mean, the important thing is that you charge it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we're out of time for this week, but I wanted to thank everyone for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. If you'd like to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Even though Annalisa's not with us, she's down manning the watchtowers at the fellowships with Matt, but thank you nonetheless. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you next week.
That's why you will not survive.
Ryan has entered the building. The artist, formerly known as Ryan Williams.
This podcast gonna be the death of me.
Oh, good. It's a good start.
And welcome to the
Outtakes.